My name is Miley Conton, and I'm here to do a reading review vlog on the book The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. This book was written by Frederick Douglass, who was born sometime around 1817 or 1818. Because he was born into enslavement, he was not sure of his date of birth. And he was born into enslavement, as I already mentioned, to an enslaved mother and a white father who he never knew, and his mother was most likely raped by her master. Um, the book of itself was published in 1845. Around this time, the anti-slave movement was picking up, and also the women's suffrage movement was also in action. Also going on was the Second Great Awakening, which was the revival of Protestant religion around the states. And this was the second time that a revival such as this was happening. And the Underground Railroad was in use. And the Underground Railroad was a passage that was used by slaves to be moved from their enslavement to areas or states or communities where they could be considered free. Frederick Douglass himself does believe that the Underground Railroad was too known about or too popular to be considered underground, but it still was successful in leading several slaves to their freedom. Now, the book of itself sold around 30,000 copies between 1845 and 1860, which is when the first edition was published, and it was second only in sales around this time to the Holy Bible. In the book of itself is a story of his life from his childhood days in enslavement to him being a free man. Interestingly enough, we see a lot of his life as a slave when he was younger, and he skims over the details of him escaping. He skims over the details of his escape, and then we see in the last chapter that he's living as a free man in Baltimore. Also, we see that he pretty much doesn't mention names of many people who helped him in his escape and his journey, even the little boys that taught him how to read. And this is because he is trying to prevent anyone from falling into trouble. He basically wants to take all the responsibility for himself. So if any malevolent forces come from his publishing of the book, if there's any outcry or general outburst, or if there's any law that comes into place, if he's hunted down, he will be the only one that is affected, and nobody else will have to take the fall for him. And not only that, but he skims over the details of his escape and other people that helped him to protect the safety of other slaves who would want to use the same exact route to go to safety. Because if he published and publicized his escape, then slave owners and enslavers would be made aware of the way he escaped, and they would take measures to make sure that that particular method of escape would be shut down. We also see just a lot of details of how he was passed around. He lived under chattel slavery for most of his life, and he was passed around by different enslavers until he could gain his own freedom. So he, as a writer, is an intellectual, and we can see that in his clearly thought out paragraphs and statements. But even though he's an intellectual and he has been educated, he makes sure that he's written this book at a level where any Black person or any person can understand it, regardless of their education level. He did this because this book was supposed to reach the masses and was not only supposed to teach the highest uppity person about the cruelties of slavery, but to also inspire and to give hope to those that were still in enslavement, to know that there was still a way to make it out. We see a lot of parallels between Douglass and a lot of great black people and politicians of today and in history. For example, he played a lot into respectability politics. He was trying to win over those who probably did not know that much about slavery. So he had to make sure that he was as pure as could be, for lack of a better word, so that they would have no reason to think that his cause was not worthwhile. He also made this book as a piece to uplift other black people, regardless of their level of education. And we see that a lot in a lot of politicians and heads of state and just black leaders in our community who tend to, even as they have probably gone on and gotten better lives, they also always make sure, well, mostly, I can't say always, but mostly try to make sure to reach back to their communities and where they came from and to help other people and lift other people up because they know the sacrifices that they went through. This book was also his own experiences and no one else's. And that's probably one of the things that makes the book so moving, is that these are all firsthand experiences. We see the cruelty that he experienced firsthand, and he's not lying. It wasn't passed around by word of mouth because this was real and it happened to him. Now, even though these were his own experiences, it was sugar-coated. And by that, I mean that he made sure to not mention, he made very little to no mention about any rebellions or resistance that other slaves must have put up on the plantations, even though there's evidence that there was a lot of resistance and a lot of rebellions, but he made little to no mention about that because he wanted to make sure that he tried to make sure that he can gain as much sympathy for other slaves as possible. He wanted to make them look as mistreated as possible, so that in probably a white person's eyes or somebody who's not sure whether they're for or against slavery, they can know, okay, maybe enslaved people do not deserve their cruelty. Because if he did write about rebellions, the only rebellion that he did write about was his own. And this goes back again to him taking the blame and being the only one that took the fall for anything. The rebellion he wrote about was when, as a teenager, his master took him out to the fields to beat him, and he got so enraged that he turned around and beat up his master, and his master couldn't say anything about it because he didn't want to be known as someone who was beat up by a young black man. So he pretty much made it as much as a sympathetic story as possible, and it worked because it did get to the attention of those who were not as aware of the cruelty of slavery. He gained the abolitionists more allies. So in the end, he does write a very moving piece that brings to light the terrors of slavery and the cruelties and the horrible things of slavery, while making sure that he's the only one that's accountable and responsible for anything that could have been against the law in the state that he was when he was a slave, or anything that anybody else could be held accountable for. So it is a very moving piece, and it is still used today. And it's just something very special about it is that, as I had said, it not only reached the most high class white person who probably didn't even know about these things, but it also met those that were still in slavery, those who were at rock bottom, and it gave them hope. So it gave them, to white people, it gave them knowledge. To free people, I should say, it gave them knowledge. And to those in enslavement, it gave them hope. And that's a very unique thing that not many writers could do. And he still went on to be an abolitionist, writer, and speaker, and speak out against several issues throughout his years.